So if we'd like, yes, there we are. Thank you. So my name is Andrew Thomson from Queen's University, Belfast. And one of the things that I do is I run this CRS Book Prize, and I'll be hosting today's proceedings. The running order will be that I'm going to give you a very brief introduction to the CRS Book Prize. Then I'm going to congratulate Pamina on winning this year's award. Then I'll hand over to Pamina, who will tell us all about the fascinating research that went into this prize-winning book. And then we'll have a live Q&A session at the end. So during the live Q&A session, please use the raise hand function to indicate that you'd like to ask a question. I will then call on you in the order in which those raised hands appear, or I'll do my best to do that. In addition to the Q&A session, if you want to ask a question by typing it into the chat box at any point during Pamina's presentation, then we might be able to get to that question during that live Q&A session, okay? So the Conflict Research Society Book Prize was brought in by the Society in 2010 to honor research on conflict and peace more broadly that is contemporary, exceptional, and world-leading. This year we had about 50 nominations from around the world to choose from, and our panel of judges narrowed this down to 6 shortlisted books. Now, all of those shortlisted entries were of exceptional quality, and I extend many congratulations to all the authors who made this year's shortlist. That full shortlist can be found on the CRS website. So choosing the winner was also a really difficult task with such a high quality shortlist selection. So a massive thank you to the CRS Book Prize judges for all of their hard work in reading all of the books. So thank you to Christine Cheng, Isabel Phillips, Robert Nagel, Catalina Montoya, and Govinda Clayton. After very careful consideration, we were very happy to announce Pamina Firchow as the winner of the CRS Book Prize this year for her book, Reclaiming Everyday Peace, Local Voices in Measurement and Evaluation After War. I've got my copy of the book here. So Pamina is an associate professor in the Conflict Resolution and Coexistence program within the Heller School for Social Policy and Management at Brandeis University. And she is also the CEO of the NGO called Everyday Peace Indicators. So judges on this prize committee praised Pamina's book, Reclaiming Everyday Peace, for its elegant and simple solution to the complex problems associated with evaluating everyday peace. The judges highlighted that the book offers a deep and nuanced treatment of peace as a concept, as well as a lived experience. They also said it offered a very creative and systematic approach with extensive fieldwork and methodological innovation, and they all praised its radical policy relevance. The judges all agreed that this book goes far beyond fulfilling the criteria for the CRS Book Prize, and it is a deserved winner for its outstanding scholarship. So on behalf of the Conflict Research Society, I extend my congratulations to you, Pamina. We will, of course, be presenting you with a shiny award to show off in your office. And we, of course, were hoping to give this to you in person, but given the circumstances, it looked like the post might be the best bet. Either way, it is with great pleasure that I can now hand over to you, Pamina, so that we can hear more about this excellent research. Thank you so much for joining us today, and over to you.
Thank you so much, Andrew. Thank you for this enormous honor. I'm thrilled. Receiving the 2020 Conflict Research Society Book of the Year Award has made a very difficult year much easier for me to swallow. I'm just sorry that I can't be with you in person to receive the award. I want to thank you and the Book Prize Committee and the members of the Conflict Research Society for giving me this opportunity. I'm also grateful for the opportunity to speak about my book today, so I'm going to get started. I'm going to try. There we go. All right. Okay, so since at least the mid-2000s, political scientists in particular have been studying the microdynamics of civil war. And this has become an area of increasing interest to peace researchers. However, there has been less of a focus on the microdynamics and microprocesses of peace in conflict-affected contexts. And this is where I see my work filling important lacunae in order to understand better local conceptualizations of peace and community agency in peace-building processes. Essentially, I'm looking at how do locals conceptualize peace and what are their priorities in doing so, and how does this help us evaluate and research peace building. The book addresses two main questions. First, are local level peace building efforts after war and mass violence effective? And if not, what is missing? And second, how do we most effectively measure effectiveness of peace building at a local level? And I answer these questions using the Everyday Peace Indicators methodology in a matched case research design of villages in Uganda and Colombia, which I'll get to in much more detail soon. So in order to answer these questions, I first clarify what I mean by peace building. I distinguish between small p peace building and big P peace building efforts in order to shed light on different kinds of international efforts and their interactions with locals, and to offer conceptual clarification surrounding the concept of peace building and how it's being used by practitioners and also by academics and researchers. Big P peace building, as I call it, refers to large-scale interventions that include everything from sustainable development assistance to global health and infrastructure. Typically, we see international organizations such as the UN and the World Bank use the term peace building in this way, as well as political scientists who are empirically studying peace building. In contrast, small p peace building refers to more localized and relationship-oriented efforts to build peace at the community level. These efforts include exercises related to dialogue, memorialization, and reconciliation processes, as well as other efforts to strengthen the social fabric of communities. When local and international civil society organizations dedicated to building peace refer to peace-building efforts, they are usually speaking about this kind of small p peace building. And conceptual clarification is important because without understanding succinctly what is meant by the term peace building, we are unable to determine the boundaries between what is included and what is excluded in that term. So the results of the study I present in the book that we're talking about today, Reclaiming Everyday Peace, illustrate that small p interventions are fundamental to building peace in contexts that have received a significant number of big P interventions. In other words, conflict-affected localities that have received interventions from multiple international actors are more likely to require assistance in building community ties and social cohesion than those that have received little or no peace-building assistance at all. In contexts where there have been big P peace-building interventions alone, societies were not likely to be any more peaceful, according to obviously their own community-generated indicators of peace, which I'll go over in a moment, than those with few or no interventions. But let me show you how I got to these conclusions first. So measuring the microdynamics of peace is no easy task. Unlike the microdynamics of civil war, there are no concrete events to measure, like battle deaths or injuries or rebel group movements. What to measure can become highly subjective, and decisions about what is important and therefore measured are often made by outsiders and experts, rather than insiders and locals who are living the peace we're trying to measure. Therefore, I present and operationalize a methodology that I co-created with my colleague, Professor Roger McGinty, called the Everyday Peace Indicators, or as we call it, EPI for short. EPI is based on the premise that local community members are those who are best placed to identify changes in their circumstances, rather than relying on external experts to identify indicators for them. It is also based on the premise that peace, as well as conflict, security, and development, is experienced and embodied at the local level. In bringing together localized experiences and measurement, EPI attempts to build bridges between epistemological and methodological divisions in the social sciences. The challenges with a top-down process of indicator generation and quantitative measurement is reflected in the debates between interpretivists and positivists, where interpretivists are generally more concerned with capturing all attributes of a concept, as well as being concerned with the relativity of concepts. Whereas positivists are more concerned with what is measurable, generalizable, and identified as belonging in a conceptual data container. Obviously, these contrasts are somewhat of a caricature. And I realize that there are a lot of overlaps and there's a lot of gray between these approaches, not to mention mixed method approaches. But generally speaking, these are some of the main methodological tensions that exist between scholars working from positivist and interpretivist standpoints and represent the potential bridges that EPI can build. So now I'm going to provide a very brief overview of the everyday indicator process, which was the methodology used in this book. I'll also go over the research design and then go over the findings on local level peace building effectiveness found in the book. It's important to remember that with the everyday indicators, we are conducting systematic research and data collection to produce participatory numbers. That is, numbers that are generated from the bottom up using rapid rural appraisal techniques and participatory action research at the very local level, so at the village or at the neighborhood level. And there are 4 steps involved in the EPI process. So first we start with focus groups. And the focus groups, we work with representatives of the community, the village or the neighborhood, and I can talk more about exactly who participates in those focus groups in the Q&A and more also about the details of the methodology later. But in the interest of time, I'm going to sort of speed through this. So we typically, in most cases, and in this study for the book, conduct 3 focus groups, one with men, one with women, and one with youth. And we talk in those focus groups about the concept that we're measuring, in this case, peace, and look at and ask specifically, begin to probe about what signs people look to in their daily lives to determine whether they are more or less at peace. So what are the tangible signs or the tangible indicators that people look to in their daily lives when they're thinking about whether they are more or less at peace? And these indicators are then verified through a participatory process that involves the community. And this ensures that the indicators are as representative as possible of the community and also narrows down the list of available indicators. And this process is called the verification process. So it's a bigger group process in which we have lists of indicators that are gleaned in those original focus groups. And there's a process of verification, and then there's a voting process where community members select their top indicators. So after the verification process, we have our short list of indicators. In each village, we typically collect between 40 to 60 of these indicators, although the number was lower in this study. Here are some examples of indicators in the localities in this particular study. You can see how localized and diverse they are, representing multiple dimensions of peace and using local terminology. So individual indicators can be analyzed on their own to say specific things about how people conceptualize peace in their locality. They can be used to address community concerns. They can be very specific and guide organizations to do programming about a specific issue that is most important to the community. But the problem is that they are often too specific, and it's difficult to see the forest for the trees. So we code indicators into categories to get a broader picture of needs and priorities for a community. And this process can also help government, civil society, or international actors plan programming and needs assessments in localities. So we create code books and categories within those code books and have coders code, usually it's a team of 3 coders, code the indicators into the categories. And the code categories and the code books are inductive. So we use content analysis of the actual indicators themselves to create the categories and the code books. So the categories can change depending on context or purpose. So we have several different code books which are available on our website, everydaypeaceindicators.org. And here's an example, or at least abbreviated example of one of them. So the indicators then provide the basis for questions that allow us to understand more about that concept in a community over time. And one way is to survey communities over time with the indicators in order to understand whether they are at peace according to their own indicators and how that changes over time. This is useful, for example, to evaluation interventions that are introduced, to evaluate interventions that are introduced, but also for longitudinal research studies. And really, the surveys are not any different from regular surveys. They're just populated by these everyday indicators, these community-generated indicators. So in addition to the focus groups in the EPI process, for this book, I conducted over 100 in-depth interviews and collected longitudinal survey data over 3 years for a total of 2,038 surveys. The household surveys were face-to-face using mobile phone survey applications, and the questions consisted of demographics, questions about the interventions that the community had received, and questions based on the everyday indicators. And the data was collected from 2013 to 2016. The study was conducted in 2 matched case villages in Uganda and 2 matched case villages in Colombia. Both had the same matching criteria, which I'll briefly go over now using the example of the Colombian villages in the interest of time. The countries were chosen for the similar tactics chosen by combatants and state engagement with locals. Both contexts had high levels of suspicion, collaboration, and denunciation between civilians, armed combatants, and state actors. And also, the massacres in the villages happened around the same time period, as did the peace-building interventions. So now I'm going to go over the selection criteria of the Colombian villages. To give an example of this, the similarity between the villages that were also selected in Uganda. So the villages in each country had as similar as possible demographics, histories of violence and displacement. They had the similar religious and ethnic composition, but they differed vastly in their levels of external intervention after the violent events. And I'll show that to you in a minute. The villages were matched for their similarities in everything but the amount of intervention, with the goal of matching villages that had little to no intervention with villages that had received enormous amounts of external interventions, resulting in their reputation among the international community and also domestically as laboratories for peace. So as you can see, in one of the villages in Colombia, Don Gabriel, there were really minimal interventions. Oops, sorry about that. So mainly reconstruction efforts by the government and some humanitarian assistance and a little bit of help from the United Nations. Whereas El Salado has seen more than 120 external actors implement hundreds of projects, was deemed a laboratory for peace. Pretty much, if you're Colombian, you've heard of El Salado. So you can see the match case, very similar communities, very different levels of intervention post-conflict. So my findings from these matched case studies show that in Uganda and Colombia, the localities with high levels of intervention particularly prioritize social issues. And these are the findings from the indicator analysis, right? The analysis, as I explained, in the categories of the indicators themselves. So they prioritize social issues such as community cohesion, interdependence, and conflict resolution over security and development when they were identifying their everyday peace. So this is how they conceptualized their everyday peace. And this is important because efforts at attending to social cohesion and social psychological factors were the least that were attended to by external actors in these communities. And there was a clear external priority given to governance and security reform, job creation or livelihoods, as well as infrastructure. And I'm not saying that these are not important. These are all important elements of assisting communities after war, but they can also bring with them unintended consequences that, if left unattended, have counterintuitive consequences. And I'll get to that in a moment, especially if the social fabric is not intact. So therefore, with little attention paid to relationship building and reconciliation efforts in the communities with otherwise high levels of intervention, my findings suggest that there is no overall substantively higher level of peacefulness according to community-generated indicators of everyday peace than those with little to no intervention at all. So this is looking at the survey analysis and comparing the communities. Here are examples again from Colombia, but these were cross-cutting results across the study. The results suggest that there are disparities between what localities need after war and the interventions external actors prioritize in their local peace building and reconstruction efforts. I also found that although communities with higher levels of intervention increased levels of, I also found that although communities with higher levels of intervention reported increased levels of development, they also reported higher levels of perceived insecurity. Now, if you think about it, this makes sense. So let me give you an example. It makes sense especially at the local level. For example, let's say a peace building project builds a road into a village, right, to bring development infrastructure to a region. That can bring in unsavory new visitors that affect community dynamics or challenge traditional community norms, which are already significantly weakened because of the war. Or, for example, creating new jobs may seem admirable at first, but at closer examination, these jobs may be taking away from youth from traditional farming and agricultural practices. And I saw this a lot in Uganda. And the traditional community structures in these communities are so weak, or they no longer exist at all, that they cannot support these youth to flourish. So a flurry of interventions that support the material functioning of a community allow people to proceed on autopilot by being guided by external actors rather than actually rebuilding their own communities and social ties, which provide them with increased security in their community. So this means that conflict-affected communities with large amounts of what I call big P peacebuilding assistance or assistance in reconstruction and development require more interventions pertaining to social cohesion and community social relations than those with little to no assistance. Infrastructure, security, and development projects are often prioritized over relationship building, and actors often end up substituting the building of a road for real engagement with the root causes of conflict, and this really becomes a problem locally. In fact, these localities are actually much more in need, those that have received the most development and infrastructure, big P peacebuilding projects, of the kinds of relationship building efforts that can be supported by the international peacebuilding community than those that have had to rely entirely on their own efforts in reconstructing their communities after war and have naturally reconstructed that social fabric. This means that without a significant investment in the social dimensions of peacebuilding work, such as dialogue or conflict resolution, memorialization, and trauma healing, broader peacebuilding interventions such as reconstruction efforts and governance or security reform will not be effective at establishing sustainable peace. In addition, my study found that although localities prioritize social cohesion related indicators when defining everyday peace, overall people chose indicators that fell into multiple categories, showing the multidimensionality of peace and representing both positive and negative peace. And this is really relevant for measurement since the majority of top-down attempts at measuring peace use indicators that focus primarily on violence reduction. And therefore they may miss important elements of what comprises the actual building of peace after war. So in conclusion, the findings of this study have major implications for how we measure peace conceptually, as well as how we measure peacebuilding effectiveness on a project level. It demonstrates the importance of including localities in the generation of statistics and numbers, and not just treating people as data sources. And it stresses the critical importance of the social dimensions of peacebuilding interventions, which are often forgotten or sidelined in the rush to reconstruct or stabilize. The everyday peace indicators and the wider field of participatory numbers has incredible potential to help us advocate on behalf of marginalized people where their needs and priorities may get lost in an increasingly quantitative world that prioritizes numbers for policy change and guidance. And there's evidence that peacebuilding actors and researchers are realizing the potential of EPI as a tool to help move the field in that direction. We have now worked in villages and neighborhoods in 11 countries worldwide on a variety of different projects with a wide range of partners from US government agencies, the UN, and civil society groups. Although all of our projects have a research dimension, many of them are also applied in order to help guide or evaluate local planning and programming. We are also working on other concepts apart from peace, such as reconciliation and justice. As I said earlier, EPI is really something that can address difficult to define social concepts. And so we have been using the same process to also measure reconciliation, measure justice, and other difficult to define concepts. And I can answer more questions about what other work we're doing currently, if that's of interest to you. So thank you very much. Our website is being reconstructed at the moment, but next month you'll be able to see more of the depth and expanse of the projects that I was just talking about. And you can also follow us on Twitter for more information. I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Excellent, Pamina. Thank you so much for that fascinating presentation. I very much enjoyed reading your book, which I've got here, and I very much enjoyed hearing about it from you. Well, I was going to say in person, but yeah, live. I've certainly learned a lot, so thank you very much for that. I'm still around. Oh yeah, okay. I'm still around. For some reason, I lost the screen. So we've got a moment for, we've got about 20 minutes or half an hour for Q&A session. So could you please use the raise hand function on Zoom, and I will call on you to unmute your microphone if you want to ask a question. And if you'd like, please turn on your camera as well. I noticed throughout the entire presentation, everybody's got their camera off, so it's very difficult to see, well, to see you and engage. I'll do my best to get your questions in order in which you raise your hand. And when you do come online, please say what your name is, and can I remind you to stick to questions. Yeah, so who has some questions? Any questions? Yes, you'd have to unmute yourself. I can't see the raise hand function. Owen, you'll have to unmute yourself. Let me see if I can find it.
You have to click on participants.
Yeah, I've got that, yeah. Ask to unmute. There you are, Owen. No, it's not working. Technical difficulties. Is it Owen Green, yes? Okay. Let's see if we've got someone else. Owen, we'll come back to you once you find out how to unmute your microphone. We've asked you to unmute it, but we can't hear you at the moment. So we'll come back to your question in a second, okay? We've got Alisha Kamidov.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you just fine. Yes, thank you.
I think that this presentation is fascinating. And I worked for the World Bank as a consultant in Kyrgyzstan in the post-conflict. In 2010, Kyrgyzstan witnessed a massive ethnic conflict. So I observed firsthand the problems that international intervention can bring. But I have a question here, and it has to do with communities. There's a tendency within the World Bank to view communities as in kind of glossy, perfect ways, like they are like cohesive units that speak in one voice. But my own experience was different. I could see that communities are essentially hierarchies with set rules, and who you include in discussions actually affected communities greatly. These hierarchies, for example, women, when we included women in our discussions, men felt that they were overpowered. So in sum, my question is this, can we view communities as just monolithic units, or should we view them in including them in discussions as diverse, as hierarchies with their own problems? In other words, should we not view them as perfect units? Thank you.
Pamina, since I don't think anybody else has got their hand up right now, do you want to answer that question? Or should we go back? Well, yes, answer that question, then we'll go back to Owen Green.
Okay, sure. Thank you for that question. Yeah, community and the definition of community is a very complex topic and issue that I think we have gotten around by geographically defining our communities, because for us, our indicators are very much geographically tied, right? They're tied to people's everyday lives, tied to their workspace, tied to their home space. And so, we have to define our communities as a village or a neighborhood. But of course, that doesn't mean that there are these clean villages and neighborhoods. And in fact, that's what makes this process most interesting, right? And what gives the depth to the indicators, and also allows us to, in a way, and anthropologists would probably kill me for saying this, but create a kind of mini ethnography of sorts, right? These are narratives that are told through these indicators, narratives of a community that also may have conflicts. And sometimes we see indicators on our lists that are, that conflict. And so it demonstrates that, you know, we are also including different members with different perspectives and understandings in the focus groups and in the verification sessions, and not just relying on one sector of the community. Now, this gets a bit more messy when we're talking about like different ethnic groups. What we've done, so we're working, not in this project, but in another project in Sri Lanka, we made decisions to work only within one ethnic group within each community. And then we would work with multiple different ethnic groups. So, but the process would be done with one ethnic group to create community indicators for that ethnic group in the community, because it would be too tense and difficult to create indicators for a geographical community for multiple different ethnic groups. Yeah, I mean, I think we have tried to be as careful and as intentional as possible when we think about how we define communities and how we engage with them. And as a matter of fact, I think, you know, the highest quality work that we produce is work that where there's been a significant presence of EPI or my own presence. So over years, a sustained presence in a community to really understand the local dynamics of that community rather than, you know, a quick and dirty process.
Excellent, thank you. We've got Gillian Dare.
Thank you. I just wanted to build on that particular point that Alicia raised, though. Did you find that the indicators that the different groups in a community raised were different? So between men and women, yes, between older people and younger people, do they have different perceptions of actually what constituted peace for them? Going to the well to get water is one thing, doing something else if you were a man is another, being able to stay at school if you're a child, etc. Did you find there were different dimensions, and how did you cope with that in a single study? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Gillian. Yes, absolutely. The indicators in the different groups varied significantly. And not only that, but in the second stage of the indicator generation process and the verification, and then especially in the voting process, there's real competition between the different groups about, you know, making sure that their indicators get on that final list, right? We have what we call long lists and short lists, and the long lists are the lists that come into the verification process. And then the short lists are what are produced after the verification and the voting process. And so during that process, you can really see a kind of tension there, because in particular, youth are enormously passionate about getting their indicators into the list. And sometimes, you know, an individual will vote, they have a limited number of votes that they can use to vote for their indicators. And they'll use 5 of their votes just for one indicator to make sure that it gets into the final list. We did do some analysis of our lists to also look into this a little bit more systematically as researchers. And we found that we were particularly worried that in the verification process, somehow, you know, men might overtake the process. And so we looked at whether all of the final, or the majority of the final lists, or sorry, final indicators came from a particular group. And we found that that was not the case, that they were pretty evenly distributed, actually. And even just in witnessing the process myself, it's really interesting because, you see, once participants of the focus group see the lists, I mean, that's their aha moment often too, because it's the first time that they see them written down. And they also see other groups' indicators, and they're really surprised by indicators that they didn't think of themselves, because it's not, you know, part of their everyday lives. But then they begin to realize, oh yeah, but this is also important for our community. And you'll see, you know, men voting for women's indicators and for youth indicators and vice versa. So I hope that answers your question.
Excellent. I believe we've next got Amanda White.
Hi, I had a question. Pamina, I really enjoyed your presentation, and recognizing that no two situations are the same, I'm wondering if you could just share maybe some of the most unique or unexpected indicators that you observed during your study. Thank you.
Thank you for that question. We have a lot of unique and unexpected and interesting indicators. I could probably go on for the rest of the session about these. Roger loves the barking dogs indicator because he has 2 dogs at home, so it's one that he loves to use in all of his examples. But, you know, of course, one of the dimensions of peace is security, and barking dogs would indicate security in a village, right? One of my favorites is antennas on rooftops. This one is from Afghanistan. This one was an indicator of violent extremism in Afghanistan. And basically it represents, I mean, it makes sense if you think about it. When you come into a village, the Taliban has different levels of control of different villages. And locals look to the amount of antennas on rooftops and the kinds of antennas on rooftops. So if it's, for example, a satellite dish, then there's probably no presence of Taliban. Whereas if there's absolutely no antennas whatsoever, good likelihood of a high presence of Taliban, right? And so I think that's an indicator that makes so much sense because the Taliban, of course, controls the communication that's coming in and out of villages. But it's one that I would have never thought of myself, you know, from afar. One that I thought was just heartbreaking from South Africa was an indicator. It was that the coroner comes to pick up bodies in a timely fashion, because in many areas the bodies, there's just too many bodies, and the coroner can't pick them all up in a timely enough fashion. And so for people, an indicator of peace is that there aren't a bunch of dead bodies laying around. So, I mean, that in and of itself, you know, shows you how dire the situation is there and how violent.
Excellent. Yeah, we've also got Ursina next.
Yes, hi everyone. Thank you very much, Pamina, for your talk so far. My question goes into the direction of impact and policy. I think, if I remember correctly, Andrew, you mentioned that one of the judges said that this book is highly policy relevant, and from the findings that you mentioned, this makes perfect sense to me, that obviously big P interventions need to be designed differently or together jointly with small p interventions, etc. So what has been the experience so far? I mean, the book has been out, I think, couple of months. So were there any reactions, or are you planning, or have you been doing some kind of outreach, or you know, talking to the policy level, and how do you estimate the impact of this research? And will maybe some of the policy reactions then again impact the continuation of your research even? Thank you.
Thank you, Sina. Yeah, that's a great question, and one I think I could also go on about for the rest of the session and beyond. Yes, I have to say that we've been kept very busy. After this book was published, I established an NGO, and Everyday Peace Indicators now has a team of researchers working with it. So when I say we, I really mean we. There's a group of us, and we're working on various different projects. Right now, primarily in Colombia and in Sri Lanka. And we're, I mean, in terms of policy relevance, I mean, there's really two aspects to the work that we're doing and how we can influence policy and, I guess, programming, right? One is evaluative and programmatic. So, the indicators, and in particular the indicator analysis in the categories with the code books, can help organizations in their planning needs. The use of the indicators in surveys can help organizations with their evaluation needs. And we're doing this in Sri Lanka in a large project in the northeast and south of the country with USAID funding and in partnership with USIP. And so we're really embedded in their reconciliation programming. They have, I think it's a $12 million, something like that, project of reconciliation work that they're doing, and we're embedded in that project to help guide the program partner in the interventions that they do locally, and then also help evaluate the impact of those interventions. However, there's also a sort of broader policy potential of the EPIs that's really come out from that project as well. And that is using the everyday indicators as an advocacy tool. So many of the indicators that, that we collect are larger or address larger issues than an implementing partner can reasonably resolve. And so, so what we're doing is working with USIP to transform those indicators into advocacy tools on the behalf of the communities vis-a-vis the government. And so in that way, also hopefully affect policy at the governmental level.
Excellent. Next, we've got Sebastian.
Hello, everyone. Here from Colombia. My English is not very fluent, but I'm gonna try my best. First of all, Pamina, you have done an amazing work. It's really important to measure peace and to understand peace from other perspectives. Here in Colombia, we have studied on political science like a very classic perspective from peace, and these kind of things gives us a lot of tools to think from today on. My question is about what have you learned from the Colombian experience, especially from Dabeiba, the place you're working today in the Everyday Peace Indicators, and what experience can you tell us about this? And thanks for the space to everyone.
Thank you, Sebastian. So Sebastian is referring to a different project than the project that's in this book. And that project is a project called Everyday Justice. And it's a project where we're looking at coexistence and justice indicators in 3 departments, in villages in 3 departments of Colombia. We've started in Antioquia, in Dabeiba, and the purpose is to, well, our constant goal to understand localized conceptualizations of these difficult concepts. But also what we've done is we've created a research design where we can evaluate the local reception of different post-accord mechanisms. So this is another presentation in and of itself. But out of the Colombian Peace Accord, there are multiple different post-accord mechanisms. And those post-accord mechanisms have, of course, local impact. And so by creating a research design where there are different mechanisms in different communities and using the everyday indicator process within those communities, we can compare the reception of these different mechanisms according to these community generated indicators. I think I'll stop there because it seems like there's a lot of other questions, but Sebastian, I know you've already gotten in touch, and I'll be in touch soon and answer more questions about that project.
Excellent. I think we've got two last questions coming up here, and I think there might be one in the chat that we might potentially get to towards the end. We've got Megumi next.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I can echo so many of your presentation. And I work from the UN and also the Japanese government side, and then aid side. And also I'm a researcher 9 years on the rebel community inside. And then I have a question about the, I see so many dynamics in the community level. And for example, my area is Southern Philippines, and they have two major rebel groups, and they have a governance structure already. And there is another government structure. So there is a couple of government structures. And then I wonder how to, and the people depend on their security, either rebel or government security force. And I wonder how to measure they could express different perspective, especially the silent mass. How did you measure the silent mass, the real intention? Because I spent 4 years, I did the same procedure as you said 9 years ago, and I spent 4 years to figure out the real issue. So could you tell me how did you figure out the silent mass, the real intention?
Yeah, the hidden transcript.
Yes.
I think that's a really challenging question, and one that we can only strive for, right? We do have some mechanisms in place to try to make community members feel as safe as possible. But really, as I said earlier, the strongest and most high quality results about community level work comes from sustained interaction with communities, like you said, 4 years, right, of spending time with communities and understanding the dynamics. I think, we try in our studies, especially in our academic work, to complement all of the everyday indicator research with qualitative data as well, and with participant observation, and so that it's a really multi-method approach. But that said, in the process, we really do try to find ways to make people most comfortable. And oftentimes, I mean, the questions that we're asking, for the most part, are usually questions that people feel comfortable discussing. And so information is shared in a relatively comfortable environment. When we go into the verification sessions, we make sure that there aren't any additional people present that are not participating in the process. So we want to make sure that anybody who is participating or who is present is participating in the process, because even though they may make other members uncomfortable, at least they are part of the process rather than perhaps observing from afar. So we do everything possible to protect the participants so that they can feel as comfortable as possible to give us the indicators that represent their everyday peace. And then, of course, you need some additional work to really dig down deep.
Thank you.
Fantastic. We've got one last question from Maluz.
Yes, hi. Thank you very much for your talk. Extremely interesting, and the book's great. I actually have a bit of a question that kind of jumps from the book towards the work that you're working on now. You mentioned that you're looking at sort of these conceptualizations of justice and reconciliation. Looking at your code books, and I'm sure you could come across this, a lot of the conceptualizations, even in the academic world, sort of overlap. How do you address this? Are you looking at the three sort of in parallel, or are you really focusing in on one? And how do you sort of, just how are you dealing with these sort of overlap in general?
Yeah, I see what you mean. You mean that the concepts overlap. Yeah. Yeah, so we do the processes separately. We don't do them, so we do a process for each concept. So we can't really control what indicators are selected. The only process, or the only part where we come in is really in the transfer of the focus group discussions to the verification lists and discussion. And so we don't, and we try to be as true to the process as possible. And so we can't really manipulate the lists or really, do anything about that. For the most part, from what we have found in our analysis, there is a distinction in the communities, and it does come out. There are certain categories that are more salient when it comes to one concept versus another, right? So it's not flat. When you look at the comparison, for example, in Antioquia between the indicators of justice and reconciliation or coexistence, you really see certain themes emerge. Like, for example, with our justice indicators, there's a strong theme of the state and the interaction of communities with the state, right? Whereas with the coexistence indicators, although, obviously there are overlaps, that theme is not as strong, and it's much more about community interactions and social cohesion. We really let the communities decide for themselves about the conceptualizations.
Okay, great, thanks. I could ask a million more questions, but I'll leave it at that. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Marlies. Yeah,
I think we've got one question in the chat, and I think we have about enough time to get to it, if that's okay with you, Pamina. Megan Greeley asks, how have you tried to avoid the EPI methodology being used as another linear, projectized way of operating with your NGO partners?
Again, all really good and challenging questions today. So this is an interesting question, which I can tie in with another new project. For a long time, we've been asking about the utility of EPI as a tool that organizations might be able to use to evaluate or to plan their programming. And one of the challenges, well, initially the challenge was, Roger and I are academics. Our priorities lie in publications and research, so it wasn't our main focus. But now an opportunity has arisen where we can look into this with more time and also more staff, where we're looking at potentially creating tools, everyday peace indicators tools. And the main reason for this is because the everyday peace indicators process, as you might have noticed, is quite intense. It takes time, effort, and it takes a lot of money and accompaniment. And so in a sense, we've created a tool in order to access local communities that we've become gatekeepers of. And this is a problem. And so we want to make it more accessible. But we are also concerned about, I think it was Megan's concerns about it just becoming a box checked, right? A problem-solving mechanism. And so we've started, or we're about to start, a community of practice with a variety of different organizations, including UN partners in Tunisia, the Search for Common Ground, and a human rights organization in Colombia called the Asociación Minga, where what we're going to be doing is looking at what are the issues that different organizations have with indicators? Because whenever we talk to civil society actors in particular, they always have challenges and problems with indicators. So what specifically are the problems? And not only that, but are they different for different kinds of organizations? Are they different for different kinds of projects? Are they different in different kinds of contexts? And so we're looking across many different contexts at community-based organizations, national organizations, and international organizations to see what are these issues that they're confronting. And then we're also transferring knowledge about the everyday indicators process. There's a series of trainings and capacitation involved to get to essentially train experts within these organizations so they then understand the everyday peace indicators methodology and can adapt the methodology to their own organizational needs, and we can assist with that process, so provide technical assistance along the way. And then at the end, the question will be, what is the most valuable tool that can come out of the process? Is it possible to create a monitoring and evaluation programming tool based on the everyday indicator process? Maybe it's not possible. Is it one tool? Is it 15 tools? Is it trainings? These are questions that we're asking in this project in order to be able to see how we can really operationalize EPI to try to change peace building for the better.
Excellent. So unfortunately, I think that's all the time we have left for those questions and answers. But thank you very much, Pamina, for your excellent presentations and for your answers to all of those fantastic questions as well. And I would like to say thank you to the audience for listening and for your engagement. Those are some fantastic questions. And I'm really happy to hear from people from all around the world. I mean, I was quite amazed with that. And of course, you know, these types of platforms allow for it. And I was really happy to hear that both academics and policymakers are amongst the audiences engaging with this work. So I think that went very well. So thank you to you all. I would also like to take this opportunity very quickly to give particular thanks to the organizational team for this event. So that is Robert Nagel, Marina, and Phil, for putting this together and promoting the event. And I'd like to thank Marina and Gov, who are sort of technical gurus, working somewhere in the background to make sure that everything ran smoothly. Although I think I scared someone away who was actually just talking with them. The first person didn't want to actually ask a question. I realized very quickly. But that's okay. That's the way these things go. I'd also like to take this last opportunity to hand over to Govinda or someone else in the Conflict Research Society to tell us a bit about future Conflict Research Society events that are online that will be happening. Gav, or someone else, yeah?
Sure, thanks a lot, Andrew, and thanks a lot, Pamina, and thanks everyone for coming along. It's really great to see so many people here. So yeah, I mean, we have 2 more events that we have on the slate already, as it were. So next month, we're going to be having a town hall event, where we're going to be discussing diversity and representation within the CRS. So inspired by recent events, we want to really have a discussion amongst our membership about what specific actions we should be taking as an organisation. And then the week after the US elections, we're going to be having another event with a number of speakers where we'll be looking at how the result of the US presidential election is influencing conflict work around the world. So I hope you'll come back and join those, and do please check out our website. And if you're not a member, do join, and we can keep you up to date with everything we're doing. But thank you very much, and over to you again, Andrew.
Yeah, and fingers crossed that we'll actually be hosting a face-to-face conference here at Queen's University Belfast in August of 2021. Fingers crossed for sort of positive developments with respect to the global pandemic. Again, thank you so much to Pamina, to everybody who has come up to say, and we look forward to seeing you in the future. Goodbye, guys. Lovely to see you. Take care.
Bye-bye.